Ariel. It is a pleasure to be here with you this evening. Thank you so much for joining me for Ada Louise Huxtable's New York. I am so thrilled to share this event with so many notable and necessary preservation organizations around New York City, and I think it is appropriate to do so when we speak about Ada Louise Huxtable and her city and her legacy in New York, because she touched every area of the city, and her role as an advocate for sensible development and for preservation allows us to think about the kind of city that we want to live in, the kind of built environment we need, and allows us to build on her legacy. It is particularly wonderful now in March of 2021 to speak about Ada Louise Huxtable's New York, because March 14th, 2021 would have been her 100th birthday. So this is not only a Women's History Month celebration of Ada Louise Huxtable and her life and legacy, but also a centennial celebration of that life and legacy. So who was Ada Louise Huxtable? Well, she was a native New Yorker, and as the first full-time architecture critic at any American newspaper, the New York Times actually created that position for her specifically in 1963. She is credited with creating a new profession and also with changing the way that New Yorkers and indeed people around the country saw and thought about cities and about man-made environments. Now, she was a champion of livable cities, and she wrote 11 books on architecture. After her work at the New York Times, which she left in 1982 to pursue writing several of those books, she also continued her work as a working newspaper critic at the New York Review of Books, and then finally, at the end of her life, at the Wall Street Journal. In fact, she filed her last piece for the Journal in December 2012, about a month before she died. Now, when we talk about Ada Louise Huxtable's New York, it's interesting to note that the physical spaces in which she pursued her life and career are iconic locales emblematic of the city itself. So let's look at some of them. She was raised here at the St. Urban at 285 Central Park West. That's Central Park West and 89th Street. She studied at Hunter College, then at New York University's Institute of Fine Arts. Her first job out of school was at Bloomingdale's, where she was tasked with selling modernist furniture by Charles Eames and Eero Saarinen. Now, the industrial designer Garth Huxtable came to see the Eames chairs at Bloomingdale's and stayed to see Ada Louise. Indeed, the two of them together would go on to design tableware for the Four Seasons restaurant in the Seagram's building. Now, before designing flatware for the Four Seasons restaurant, Ada Louise Huxtable actually left Bloomingdale's for the Museum of Modern Art, where she became an assistant to Philip Johnson in the museum's architectural department. From there, she got a Fulbright and a Guggenheim Fellowship and published her first book. Then, in the late 1950s, she began writing for architectural journals. Then came the New York Times. In 1963, the Times created the position of daily architecture critic for her at the recommendation of Eileen Saarinen, who was the Times art critic. The Times before Ada Louise Huxtable did not have an architecture critic at all. Indeed, no daily paper in the nation had such a position. And it was Eileen Saarinen who suggested Ada Louise because the two were friends, and also because Eileen Saarinen, once she had married Eero Saarinen, the architect, believed it would be inappropriate for her to write about architecture because she considered it to be a conflict of interest. Now, Ada Louise Huxtable is seen here in 1970 at the New York Times building. And 1970 was a meaningful year for her because that's the year that she became not only the first woman, but actually the first person to win the Pulitzer Prize for distinguished criticism. Now, her role as an urbanist as a critic, and as the voice of architectural review in this nation for 50 years, is well known and is paramount, but also she won the Pulitzer Prize for criticism for writing. Her writing is extraordinary. I will read to you in this talk from her reviews and from her books, and I hope that through those quotes you can hear her voice and hear how truly extraordinary a practitioner she was of the English language. And so what's so interesting to me, and I hope comes through also in this talk, is the way that her understanding of a well-structured and livable built environment actually has a relationship to a well-structured and well-argued piece of criticism or an essay. And so I hope that those two things will go hand in hand for you during this talk. They certainly stood out to me as I was doing research for tonight's program. Now, when we think about Ada Louise's life and her legacy and the places which she inhabited in New York City, we can see that she's steeped in modernism, in this modern art world, right? That she designs for the Four Seasons, that she works at MoMA, that she's very good friends with Eileen Saarinen. You know, that there is this modernist aesthetic running through her own life. And indeed, she was, as a critic, considered to be a champion of modernism. And many of the most lauded structures of that form she herself did prize. She said of, here she is actually in front of a modernist structure. And she was also instrumental in bringing the tenets of modernism to the American public, to the idea of what is modern architecture, where would one see it in New York City, and how could one appreciate it. She was at the vanguard of what architectural appreciation might mean to a lay person, to a person who was not trained as she was in architectural history. And so through her reviews, through her walking tours, which you can see here, and through a half a century of being the public face of architectural criticism, she tried to bring the idea of taste, of good structure, of what it means to create a livable city to the public in an easily digestible and interesting way, which I really believe she did. Now, consider what she said about the CVS building, and really in a way contrasting what a critic might say and what a person on the street might say. She said, "The dark dignity that appeals to architectural sophisticates puts off the public, which tends to reject it as funeral." But she herself considered it, quote, "a building in the true classic sense, a complete design in which technology, function, and aesthetics are conceived and executed integrally for its purpose." In sum, she considered the CVS building a first-rate work of architecture and an extraordinarily impressive structure. She also had positive words for the Ford Foundation building, which is truly an extraordinary piece of architecture. I'll show you both the exterior of the building and also its incredible atrium. Of this building, she said, "Ford will never give most New Yorkers anything except this civic gesture of beauty and excellence, and that is a grant of some importance in a world where spirit and soul are deadened by the speculative cheapness of the environment." That good design was a richness for the city, that the city is enriched by good architecture and good design, and that a poverty of design is a poverty of spirit. That's what she's getting to here. Now, the idea of spiritual modernism, of course, she saw its apotheosis in the Seagram building, which she called a unique refinement, a subtleness of the relationship of color and materials that makes this building unquestionably one of the finest structures of this century. Now, she was not only a champion of excellent examples of modernism, but also a real devotee of its most illustrious practitioners. Here we have Mies, the undisputed exultant symbol of high modernism. In an obituary for Mies van der Rohe, she wrote, "In his hands, the miracle of big building engineering that marks this century, the skeleton of steel with its improbable gossamer wrapping of glass, was turned into aesthetic apotheosis. Immaculate taste was wedded to power. God is in the details," he said, in one of his infrequent explanations of an art which should have needed none. Now, she went on to appraise the man and his work. In the New York Times, she wrote, "Mies was large, in history as an innovator and talent of Michelangelesque stature, and personally as a calm, massive, craggy man with the tacit monumentality of his work. His buildings are large, soaring symbols of an age. Today, however, larger buildings are being built by smaller men." Whew, doesn't that hit you? That hits me. The way she writes is, to my ear, a pleasure to read. It is extraordinary. She said that a working critic had no use for immortality because today's newspaper wraps tomorrow's fishes, but that's not the reality, I think, with her work. We remember so much of what she wrote and what she said and how she described this city because her words became the words that we use when we think about the buildings around us. She showed New Yorkers and people around the country what architecture could mean to them in the public consciousness. She brought the idea of art and building as art in particular into the public consciousness in a way that it had not been before. Now, Christopher Hawthorne, who was the architecture critic of the LA Times and who is now that city's chief design officer, suggested after she died in 2013 that Ada Louise Huxtable championed modernism and found kinship with its practitioners like Mies van der Rohe because, he said, her mind worked the same way, as spare, powerful, ornament-free modernism of the purest variety. It sought not to complicate, but to clarify, to minimize verbal and intellectual clutter. And indeed, it seems that that was actually her mission. In 1997, she was asked in an interview with the PBS NewsHour how the untrained eye could recognize good architecture. And she said, "I really don't know. I've always seen my work, first at the Times and now at the Wall Street Journal, as telling people about it, helping them to see it, telling them where it is and what's important about it. It's a sharing. I'm a sharer. I want people to see and enjoy these things." Now, Zadie Smith has written, and I think rightly, that criticism is the discipline of knowing what you love. And Ada Louise Huxtable loved, what she loved and what she championed was design excellence that enriched society. She wrote in 1971, "Excellence always has and always will ennoble man and his surroundings if it is properly combined with a sympathetic involvement in the human condition." And she wrote also in 1975, "The search for that improbable balance between society, imperfect, and art, equally imperfect, has been my steady theme." And she never wavered from that search or gave up her conviction of the relationship between good design and an improved human experience. In fact, just before her death, she wrote in 2012, "Architecture is not just buildings, but the way in which they are put together to direct our progress through a calculated sequence of spaces, and how those relationships control our movements and our mood." And when architecture did that, when architecture was not just a building, but it enriched one's experience of the built environment, she was laudatory, as she was, for example, here at what is now called the Abrons Art Center on Grand Street, part of the Henry Street settlement. When this was built in 1975, it was called the Arts for Living Center. And she said that that name sums up everything that urban architecture should be. It's a building meant to serve and expand the life of the community, and no better definition of architecture exists than that. the fact that it is a good building, not only in the fulfillment of this basic objective, but also in terms of the more aesthetic criteria in which architecture deals, makes it doubly satisfying. But when architecture did not serve those criteria, socially or aesthetically, she did not pull punches. So whatever admiration she had for the modernist aesthetic, she had no use for dogma or idolatry. If something was not good, she would tell you. And that, again, is part of criticism, this idea of the discipline of knowing what you love, of trying to elucidate for the public what was good design. Well, sometimes we know good design because we can differentiate it from bad design. And so to differentiate good from bad, you have to be able to identify both. And she did in spades. In fact, she published a really wonderful compendium of her reviews called Kicked a Building Lately. And nobody kicked a building like Ada Louise Huxtable. She could aim a sharper kick than most anyone else and do it with a lot more eloquence, I think. So one such kick she gave to Philip Johnson over his infamous postmodern Chippendale-topped AT&T building. Now, this was a major blow to Philip Johnson, and he never forgave her. He had been her mentor at MoMA, of course, and he was hoping that she would always kind of pay homage to him in the pages of the Times, and then later in the pages of her books and in the Wall Street Journal and so on and so forth. But she had too much integrity for that. There was no person, there was no idol, there was no starchitect, there was nobody who was sort of immune to what she believed was necessary for good architecture, which was excellence in design and meaningful social purpose. And so she said of the AT&T building, "This is a skyscraper that thuds rather than soars. The postmodern historical references add up to a kind of architectural malapropism at dead drop scale. In all too solid stone and steel, the building has lost even its original anti-modernist shock value. It has turned out to be ponderously pedestrian." And of that Chippendale top, she said, "Millinery is not architecture." And neither, in her view, were lollipops at Columbus Circle. She called to Columbus Circle Edward Durrell Stone's 1964 new museum a die-cut Venetian palazzo on lollipops. It begs for a canal or a garden setting. Now, what's so interesting is that Ada Louise Huxtable was so influential in the way that she described buildings that this became known in the popular consciousness as the Lollipop building. And because of that, when it was remodeled in this century, in our own time, in 2011, it was hard for, there were preservation advocates who wanted to maintain this structure, who wanted to save it as the Lollipop building. But because it had been so decried by Ada Louise Huxtable, it, for much of the public and indeed for the Landmarks Commission, did not earn landmark status because it was not considered a good piece of modernism, because she didn't think it was. And so what became of it became this. Now, that is not the ultimate failure of modernism, though. Now, consider Ada Louise Huxtable's reaction to this, to what is now the MetLife building and was born as the Pan Am building. Of this building, she said, "The Pan Am is a colossal collection of minimums. Its exterior and public spaces used a minimum of good materials, of minimum acceptable quality, executed with a minimum of imagination, always an expensive commodity, or distinction, which comes high, or finesse, which costs more. Pan Am is gigantically second-rate, a lesson in how to be mediocre without really trying. A monumental deal does not make it monumental." Now, a very similar structure was actually proposed just 250 feet away. Where, you might ask? on top of Grand Central Terminal. This was a rendering by Marcel Breuer in 1968. She called this having your landmark and destroying it too, because since Grand Central Terminal by 1968 had been landmarked, and we'll talk about her role in the creation of the Landmarks Law in 1965, but because Grand Central Terminal had already been landmarked as an exterior landmark at that time, the issue was, okay, can we save this landmark and also allow the Pennsylvania Railroad, which owned this building, to debase it in this way, to put an office tower, a modernist office tower, on top of it, and to use the exterior, which had been landmarked, basically as window dressing, that it would have been hollowed out, it would not be a station, it would just be essentially a lobby for this building. And so having your landmark and destroying it too, because of course it would not be a station, it would not be functional for the public, you know, a people's palace as we understand Grand Central Terminal to be, but in fact, just window dressing for, you know, a brutalist modernist skyscraper. And so, as she said, having your landmark and destroying it too, she says, Mr. Breuer has done an excellent job with a dubious undertaking, which is like saying it would be great if it weren't awful. And she settles the score here. She says, no amount of talent can make a wrong thing right. And in a way, I think that's a really meaningful way of looking at the role of architecture in society. That you could have the most gifted architect in the world designing a building, but if the building does not enrich the populace and in fact destroys what is beautiful about a city, it cannot be beautiful, it cannot be good work. Because no amount of talent, as she tells us, can make a wrong thing right. And this, as I think we all can see, is a wrong thing. This is wrong. Now, speaking of wrongs, this is a cartoon that appeared in the New Yorker in 1968. I don't know if you can read that on the screen, but the caption is, Ada Louise Huxtable already doesn't like it. And of course, it's just a construction site. And so she was known for this zinging wit, right? Of no amount of talent can make a wrong thing right. You know, it's like saying it would be great if it weren't awful. That she had this cut glass wit, and she was known for being such a sharp writer that she was both enormously respected and enormously feared by architects around the nation. In fact, after she died, Frank Gehry remarked, even though I think I wished for her attention, I was scared of it. She was tough, but her words were beautiful. And I think in a way, what I hope to show you by reading from so many of her essays and reviews is that the way that she wrote, and another architectural critic once said that it was as if she was writing downhill because her arguments flowed so naturally, so easily. That the way that she understood architecture, which was buildings as part of a whole, of an entire cityscape, and not just one person and one genius and one building, that a building could be extraordinary, but it might not be good architecture if it's not in the right place at the right time, so on and so forth. In a way, that is true also of writing, that you have these whole essays that she's writing, these whole critiques. And yes, it's really lovely and easy to read you these quotes and to pull them out, but it's actually also a disservice to her work and to her writing, because what she was able to do, and I think part of why she won the Pulitzer Prize, is because she was able to create a whole argument about each building and about land use and about landmarking and about zoning and about all of these issues that New Yorkers wouldn't necessarily readily know about or even seek to know about. You know, it's not every person in New York who's going to sit down and say, I think I'll read about the 1961 zoning resolution. You know, some of us on this webinar may, because that's our interest. But if you are not deeply committed to architectural history or to zoning or to any of these things, you know, but you're just picking up a newspaper, what she did, because she was such an extraordinary writer and because of the way that she was able to structure these really beautiful and interesting essays, is that she made those things interesting. She made them spicy and zinging and exciting. And you wouldn't think about the 1961 zoning resolution, for example, as being this thrilling piece of information that you would really want to know about, but she made that the case, you know. And so in the same way that one stinging sentence is a great sentence but not a beautiful essay, it's the same way that one particular building is not a streetscape, one particular building is not a neighborhood, is not a city. And so I think that the way that she saw architecture is also mirrored in the way that she wrote and argued about architecture, which just personally moves me, and I think is really quite interesting to watch her work. But speaking of individual buildings, this idea of, did individual buildings in a particular sense matter, what she liked most, what she disliked most. And she wrote in 1971, "I wish people would stop asking me what my favorite buildings are. I have favorites because I believe quite passionately in the elegance and beauty of appropriate solutions to a problem. But I am not wildly attracted to my favorite building. I'm not wildly attached to my favorite buildings, even though I will champion the new ones or fight for the old ones to the death, naturally. I do not think it really matters very much what my personal favorites are, except as they illuminate principles of design and execution useful and essential to the collective spirit that we call society. For irreplaceable examples of that style, I will do real battle." She felt that asking about her favorite buildings, individual favorites, demonstrated a profound misunderstanding of what architecture is about. She explained, "The history of architecture has been taught as a progression of monuments. As a consequence, most of us think of architecture as a series of isolated great structures, related only by style, country, or sequence in time, which are the historian's tools for order and classification. They have little to do with the building of the real world, of which masterpieces are such a small part. Architecture is the art and science of building the entire man-made environment in terms of the way it works as much as the way it looks." And so I think that's so beautiful, that masterpieces are not the point, they are nice, right? In the sense that she says excellence always has and always will enliven a streetscape, a cityscape, but only if it is engaged with the social experience of being within that streetscape or that cityscape. And so while she believed in excellence wherever she could find it, it was only excellence insofar as it was excellent for where it was and what it was meant to do. And so she articulates this really beautifully. She says, even a beautiful building can be very bad architecture, because if it didn't improve the surroundings or positively affect the people who used it, it was not good architecture, no matter how beautifully rendered it may have been. So this idea of positively affecting the people, she said that her work as a critic put emphasis on the effect. She wrote, "The effect can be salutary or catastrophic. It can even have a chain reaction over a large area. It can help shape or destroy anything from a neighborhood to a society. That makes architecture, correctly understood and practiced, almost frighteningly important, and it is." Now, what's wonderful about that is that it frees her, as she says, she's not interested in dogma. She said, as a historian, as an architectural historian rather, I am not interested in religious wars, right? That she did not want to be caught up in exalting modernism or throwing, stones at postmodernism, so on and so forth, that she was interested in excellence, in good design, in whatever style, wherever she found it. And so, in a review of her 1964 book, Classic New York, which is subtitled Georgian Gentility to Greek Excellence, she was described as a conservationist uninflicted with sentimentality, whose enthusiasm for the best of the past is balanced by equal enthusiasm for the best of the present. Now, that's a particularly interesting balance to strike at the time that she wrote this. This was reviewed in 1964, and consider that she became the nation's first daily architectural critic in 1963, when modernism and slum clearance were the order of the day. Please remember that in 1963, this is still Robert Moses's city, right? And so while she champions great examples of modernism, as we have seen, she also knew that wanton destruction in the name of progress was ultimately a bankrupt idea. And furthermore, she understood that bulldozers pulled neighborhoods out from under New Yorkers and destroyed the urban fabric. She even maintained that an entirely modern city was not a place worth living in because, she said, without a variety of function and humanity of scale, the city becomes monstrous and insupportable. Now, her goal, as she put it in the New York Times in 1961, was to keep the best of New York. And her discussion of Lower Broadway illustrates this well. She said, somber stone and handsome 19th century Gothic spire make a dynamic foil for 20th century skyscrapers. Trinity Church offers a striking demonstration of how fine old buildings may enhance new ones and enrich a city by suggesting other times and tastes. The visual variety of the best of the old and the new provides surprise, delight, and a sense of history and style. Well, history and style, you know where this is going, right? Her writing about the destruction of Penn Station is what we think of when we think of that travesty. It was she who wrote so famously in the Times in 1963. Any city gets what it admires, will pay for, and ultimately deserves. Even when we had Penn Station, we could not afford to keep it clean. We want and deserve tin can architecture in a tin horn culture, and we will probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but by those we have destroyed. What she also did, though, which is what made her such an extraordinary force in the preservation movement, was explain in the pages of the New York Times why the City Planning Commission at that time could not save Penn Station without a landmarks law. She explained, what few realized was that however much the commission might be moved in the area of its civic conscience, it was totally without power to act on them. Why, you might ask as a reader, as I did. I didn't know this before I read Ada Louise on this. She taught me this. It is permitted to pass, she's talking about the City Planning Commission. She says, the commission is permitted to pass on the proposed use of land, not on its existing use, and therefore cannot rule on the value of a building already on the site, but only on the nature of its replacement. So the only reason that the destruction of Penn Station and the creation of Madison Square Garden on that site came before the Planning Commission at all, it had nothing to do with the grandeur and glory of this building and how could you and how could anybody and so on and so forth. It was never about that. The only reason that the City Planning Commission at all was able to review this space was because there was a question as to whether Madison Square Garden was permissible under the zoning code. And because it fit within that particular 1961 zoning resolution, there was nothing that the commission could do. Huxtable memorably explained in this case that if a giant pizza stand were proposed in an area zoned for such usage, and if studies showed acceptable traffic patterns and building densities, the pizza stand would, quote, be in the public interest, even if the Parthenon itself stood on the chosen site. So the point that she's making and what she's explaining here is that the City Planning Commission before the Landmarks Law had no way to adjudicate good architecture versus bad architecture, old versus new, anything. It wasn't an issue of the merits of what was being proposed. It could only be an issue of the legality of what was being proposed under the zoning code. And because something like Madison Square Garden was, in a technical sense, legal under the zoning code, the City Planning Commission could not, without a landmarks law, refuse permits for its creation or for the destruction of what was already there. And so that's what she's explaining. And so this question of why wasn't it saved, how couldn't it have been saved, is because the City Planning Commission had no authority prior to the 1965 landmarks law to save any such structure in the city of New York. And so when she's telling us that a pizza stand could have been erected where the Parthenon was because it was not an issue of merit, it was only an issue of like technical structural legality. But what she says though is that not that the Penn Station is the Parthenon, but it might as well be, because we can never again afford a 9-acre structure of superbly detailed solid travertine any more than we could build one out of solid gold. And about this, she indicts the city. She in fact indicts the nation and American society. She says, "It's time we stop talking about our affluent society. We are an impoverished society. It is a poor society indeed that can't pay for these amenities, that has no money for anything except expressways to rush people out of our dull and deteriorating cities." But in true fashion, with extraordinary wit and levity, 5 years later, she let us know who really scored in the destruction of Penn Station, and that was clearly the wastelands of New Jersey. She wrote in 1968, "Tossed into the Secaucus graveyard are about 25 centuries of classical culture and the standards of style, elegance, and grandeur that it gave to the dreams and constructions of Western man. That turns the Jersey wasteland into a pretty classy dump." Now, she could not save Penn Station, but she did have a strong role as a preservationist and as a critic in saving other landmarks and streetscapes. This is a view of East 62nd Street. I particularly appreciate when she wrote as a critic, not only with the eye of a critic in this very astute way, speaking about architecture and so on and so forth, but also as a New Yorker, as a walker in the city, as somebody who is walking the streets of her hometown and is particularly attuned to the beauty and allure of the streets that she loved. And this was one, East 62nd Street. She wrote in 1978, "Side streets like this one, with their mini palaces and brownstones, are not only enclaves of architectural excellence, they are quintessentially New York. They are the other side of the skyscraper coin. The glamorous milieu its upwardly mobile inhabitants aspire to, its most polished and elegant and worldly face. Any erosion of these blocks diminishes the whole city. Nor is it the loss only sentimental or aesthetic. It is the irreversible hardcore destruction of the superior architectural and environmental character that makes New York not just a big business town, but a cosmopolitan world capital as well." She said that East 62nd Street should have been landmarked, to use that awful bastard verb, from park to river a long time ago. Designation is badly overdue for many of these uptown East Side streets in whole or in part. But this is the one I go out of my way to walk on because it restores the spirit and rewards the eye. Yes, and indeed, in 1981, the Landmarks Commission did, in fact, landmark the Upper East Side Historic District, and East 62nd Street was part of that designation. And so our spirit and our eyes remain rewarded on East 62nd Street, thanks in no small part to Ada Louise Huxtable and her love for this city and the extraordinary way in which she was able to articulate it. Because again, these views that she had on architecture, what she did, her genius was not only as somebody who saw the city in such an astute and elegant way, but somebody who articulated that in a way that educated the public and moved the nation And so that is what I think is the most meaningful about her legacy. Not that she was such an extraordinary critic, which she was, but that she was able to bring that extraordinary view to the popular consciousness in a way that nobody has before or since. But speaking of the spirit, the rewards of the spirit, she was appalled by what she called the temptation of St. Bartholomew's, when St. Bart's on Madison Avenue was trying to sell off its community house to the highest bidder. She wrote in 1980 that the beauty of the St. Bartholomew block contributes to the welfare of the city, and all its inhabitants are not part of the reckoning. The close link between the spirit and the environment is denied. False and irrelevant equations are made between dealing in real estate and dealing with poverty. Although the quality of the church's art and architecture is well known, the serenity and public availability of its sun-filled and flowering garden in the congested commercial heart of the city are a less acknowledged contribution to all the people of New York. Only in a culture where commercial values have vanquished spiritual values would such a church and its setting not be considered a legacy beyond price from the past to the present and the future. Now, this was extremely contentious. St. Bart's ultimately sued the city for the right to sell the community house and was denied. Interestingly enough, though, the point that she makes about commercial values vanquishing spiritual values, that garden is still there, but today it is a private restaurant. You can eat there, and so you can experience that beauty. But in terms of a legacy and a gift, in terms of serenity and public availability, it is not, while it has been maintained, it certainly was not maintained in the way that Ada Louise Huxtable would have liked to see it maintained. And so the tension here, I think, between the need and the notion of community in New York and civic investment or even disinvestment is particularly striking, not necessarily in the case of St. Bart's, which it is, but actually more so, and she articulates this really nicely, in the case of the way that the city of New York approached its funding or lack thereof, and in particular lack thereof, of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. She wrote in 1976, "One has the feeling that the money men at City Hall are dealing in fiscal card tricks, not in a place. The cuts being made hurt most heartbreakingly and immediately in human services, but where they're going to hurt the worst in the long run is in their damage to the essential nature and quality of the city. Those areas of art and commerce, culture and communication that give New York its traditional style and strength, and that provide its competitive edge for business, talent, leadership, and money. This truth occasionally glimmers through the dismal trick figures. It is the city's real bottom line." So the point that she's making is that if City Hall, then as now, wants to use the city budget for things that are not community programs, that are not the arts, that are not libraries, that are not schools, that are not community spaces, if the city of New York wants to disinvest from the culture and the needs of the city and its people, what it's doing is actively not only impoverishing the city and its people, but impoverishing itself. Because without spaces like the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, there is no city of New York. Without human scale, without the enrichment of community and the support of community, there is no city. That buildings are nothing without the people who use them. And I think that she makes that really clear here. And so while she knew that culture was the city's real bottom line, she also saw that the bottom line of profit would destroy real culture and history in favor of a manufactured culture and history, as in what happened at the South Street Seaport and also places like Ronsi's Tavern, which she saw as a kind of ersatz historical diorama, which the city essentially destroyed its own history, its true history, so that developers could cash in on a kind of like history theme park. She called this the fake as opposed to the real fake. She said that somewhere like Las Vegas was a real fake because you knew it was fake. There was nobody goes to Las Vegas and says, I'm in New York, but when you went somewhere, like this is a historic look at Peck Slip, for example, but if you went to the South Street Seaport, you might believe that that is genuine actual preservation, when in fact it is in most cases a reconstruction of what could have or would have, or perhaps in the idea of developer should have been 19th century row houses and things like that. But in fact, the point she makes is that what the developers did at the South Street Seaport was destroy the reality of that history and its ramshackle vernacular architecture that really showed what the city looked like in the 19th century and how new styles, new technology had grown up around the South Street Seaport, and destroyed that essentially for contiguous retail space, which is why the South Street Seaport looks the way that it does today. It is particularly because developers wanted all of those buildings in a row, and they wanted the space within the repurposed Fulton Fish Market and things like that. But the way that she speaks about this is really quite lovely because it echoes the way that she talked about 62nd Street, because she brings in her own feelings as a New Yorker here. She says, I have very mixed feelings for the Seaport. I guess what I'm really doing is saying goodbye. What will surely be lost is the spirit and identity of the area as it has survived over centuries, something that may be important only to those of us who have really known and loved the small, shabby streets and buildings, redolent of time and fish and the shadows of ships, or shared the cold sunlight of a quiet winter Sunday morning on the waterfront with the Fulton Market cats when the 19th century seemed very much alive. So here we have Peck Slip very much alive, and here we have something else. And she called the Seaport a preservation merchandising complex. She asked, at what point does history drown in upscale consumerism, and does destruction by any other name smell sweeter because it also smells of money and popular success? This is not preservation, she said. It is a little hard for some of us to accept the reality that what is at the end of the preservation rainbow is the shopping center. So the idea, what she's saying here is that recreation, the destruction of actual history in favor of its recreation so that you can exit through the gift shop, as you do here, that she says is not preservation, because that is not keeping the spirit and the texture of the place alive, right? If we think about Jane Jacobs and the eyes on the street and the idea of variety and vernacular architecture, which Ada Louise Huxtable always also celebrated, she said this is not that. So this is not the goal of preservation. But the notion of the shopping center and the institutionalization of history is really interesting because she also believed that actual cultural institutions themselves had begun to sell out in New York. She told the Times in 2008, I am so weary of these stupid alliances between developers and cultural institutions in which the cultural institution is given a block of space and developers overbuild the rest and make an enormous profit. What is she talking about? None other than the very institution where her career began. She said, the Museum of Modern Art has become a real estate operation. I admit a certain amount of nostalgia. I remember a street that was once one of the best streets in New York, 53rd Street. Watching it change over the years, I can't help but view their new Nouvelle Tower as the last destructive nail. Now, she laid the issues of destructive overbuilding at the feet of a bastardized zoning regulation. And she explained what that zoning regulation was to the public and why it mattered. She said, In an attempt to legislate the impossible balance between a profitable city and a livable city, New York has created a monster. Call it Frankenstein zoning. What's been happening insidiously and overtly is that the whole idea of zoning has been turned upside down. It's been subverted from a way to control building bulk and size to a method for getting bigger and bigger buildings than ever. So what is she talking about? Well, she says the result, which is just beginning to be visible, and she said this in the 80s, of course it's visible now, is the rapid appearance of ranks of oppressively massive sun and light blocking structures of a size that we have never seen in some concentration before. Their outline and impact appeared first on Madison Avenue with the 42-story sun-blocking Tishman building and the gargantuan AT&T and IBM buildings. So here we have both of those. Now, she called these super scale. And she said, what must be understood is that this wave of bigger than ever New York building is not some overreaching passing fantasy. It is the new and future norm. And of course, she was right. But she wasn't always against large-scale building projects. Again, her idea and her champion was always good design, wherever she might find it. So in 1981, she noted that the Battery Park City Authority was not the appropriate organization to build Battery Park City. She said that the Battery Park City Authority's lack of clairvoyance was matched only by its lack of urban vision, but held that once the Urban Development Corporation was put in charge of that project in 1979, Battery Park City became, quote, a bold and spectacular addition to New York. It has the urban sophistication, the architectural standards, the financial and critical mass to put it over the top. For those of us who see this as a landmark extension of the city's skyline drama and a significant step in skyscraper design, the prospect is enthralling. Now, speaking of large building projects, we are lucky that she lived long enough to weigh in on Hudson Yards. She wrote in the Wall Street Journal, anyone who has watched this ritual real estate dance in New York before knows what to expect. After the display and discussion of a torturous path of catch-22 obstacles and Machiavellian deal-making, we will get a lot of very, very big buildings that will make someone very, very rich. There will be a great many of these very large buildings because the site is enormous. The only thing we can count on is that whatever is eventually built there will bear very little resemblance to what we are being shown now, for which we should be tremendously thankful, because it is hard to believe that teams with this much financial heft and assembled star power could come up with something so awesomely bad. Now, I will end this way with her final published piece, which was a rallying cry to save New York's awesomely good architecture. Indeed, to hold fast to the ultimate example of architecture as a marriage of design excellence and social good. That was, of course, what she had always been seeking, the relationship between excellence in design and excellence in social position. And so there is no place in this city that marries these two things better than the New York Public Library, and she believed that to be the case. She wrote in her last review in the Wall Street Journal in 2012, about a month before she died, she said, "There is no more important landmark building in New York than the New York Public Library, one of the world's greatest research institutions. Completed in 1911 by Currier and Hastings, it is a lavish classical Beaux-Arts style. It is an architectural masterpiece, yet it is about to undertake its own destruction. The library is on a fast track to demolish the 7 floors of stacks under the extraordinary Rose Reading Room." Now, the plan for this particular destruction would have moved those books in the stacks to New Jersey. And so of this, she says, This is a plan devised out of a profound ignorance or of willful disregard for not only the library's original concept and design, but also the folly of altering its meaning and mission and compromising its historical and architectural integrity. You don't update a masterpiece. Modernization may be the most dangerously misused word in the English language. But as always, she was not for a ossified or stultified city. That was never her goal. She says there are better options than turning the library into a hollowed out hybrid of new and old. The radically different 21st century model deserves a radically different style of its own, dramatically contemporary and flexible enough to accommodate rapid technological change. Sell the surplus Fifth Avenue property at 34th Street. Keep the Mid-Manhattan building. The location is perfect. Let Foster and Partners loose on the Mid-Manhattan building. The results will be spectacular and probably no more costly than the extravagant and destructive plan the library has chosen. And indeed, that's what happened. There has been and is now a renovation of the Mid-Manhattan branch across the street. And this plan by Foster and Partners, you can see it here, which would have destroyed the stacks, which actually hold up the Rose reading room. So how they were going to accomplish that without destroying the reading room is unclear to everybody. But this was defeated in 2014 by what was then known as the Huxtable Initiative. And members of the Huxtable Initiative, which were scores of architects and literary figures and artists who knew and loved the New York Public Library, said, "It sounds too good to be true, but it goes to show that criticism can actually change things." Ada Louise Huxtable's writing in the Wall Street Journal inspired us all, and particularly prompted the formation of the Huxtable Initiative, which fought and fought and fought and defeated this particular awful proposal in 2014. And what happened? The Rose Reading Room, may we thank God for it, was landmarked in 2017. And why? Thanks to the vision and the tenacity and the 50 years of unparalleled work of this woman, the great and glorious Ada Louise Huxtable. This has been her New York. Thank you so much. I am so excited to answer any questions.
Thank you, Lucy. That was great. I will start you off with an easy question. What's a good biography of her?
This is such a crazy thing. There is no biography of Ada Louise Huxtable. The best way to learn about Ada Louise Huxtable is from her own work. She published 11 books of architectural criticism, and you can go back in Times Machine, which is the name of the New York Times archive, which is all available online. It is shocking and upsetting to me to tell you that there is no biography of Ada Louise Huxtable, because certainly there should be, but her own words and her own writing are an extraordinary resource.
That is good to know and also upsetting. Okay. I have one. Did she ever change her views on certain buildings over time?
In certain ways, I suppose that you could say that she changed her view on ways that she thought that architecture could work or couldn't work. There's an example in 2012, just before she died, she wrote about the Barnes Museum, the new Barnes in Philadelphia, and the tenants of that building, when it was bequeathed as a museum, the stipulation was that nothing could be moved. And so when the collection was moved to Philadelphia, they had to keep within that. And so she said, you know, I, as a person who is against ersatz history and the recreation of history, as she was in the case of the South Street Seaport and as she was in the case of Francis Tavern, she said, you know, I wanted this not to work. I wanted to hate this new Barnes collection, the idea of taking this museum and transporting it somewhere else as if it is the same. But she conceded that, in fact, it shouldn't work, but it does, that it was really good architecture. And so while I don't believe there are cases where she walked back things that she said. Like, she didn't one day wake up and go, you know what, I love the Pan Am building. That was never the case, but she was always willing to say, you know, I thought that something like this couldn't work, and here in this case it does.
Okay, interesting. We have heard how her opinion has certainly affected the public, and plans and thoughts were changed, but someone asked, did the planning department, did anything that she said have any effect on their decision making?
You mean the Landmarks Preservation Commission?
They asked about the planning department. So I think LPC, which I would assume it would be too late at that point, but.
Yeah, so the Planning Commission, again, and she explained this with the issue of Penn Station, was that the Planning Commission didn't have the idea of like its thinking and so on and so forth. Like, the Planning Commission really didn't think, and that was the point that she was making. It was never about what was good architecture. It was always about what was strictly legal under the zoning code. And so in terms of the thinking of the Planning Commission, she said it herself that any appeal that she would have made could not have been meaningful, even if it was meaningful in a personal way to individual members of the Planning Commission. As a legal body, there was nothing really they could do, which was why the 1965 Landmarks Law and then the Landmarks Preservation Commission was such a revolution in New York. And of course, her work and her words deeply influenced the work of the Landmarks Preservation Commission.
Mm-hmm. Someone asked if you could stop sharing your screen.
Oh, sure.
I think it's just to see you better. Yeah.
Hello.
Someone asked, what did she think about the development of Lincoln Center on the West Side, which, though adding a great cultural resource, destroyed a whole neighborhood?
Yes, she was initially not interested in Lincoln Center for that reason. And so she believed, as many people did at that time, that it would have been much more appropriate and meaningful and useful for the city of New York to spread out cultural institutions so that a number of neighborhoods could enjoy them, and also so that you wouldn't be destroying San Juan Hill wholesale. And so initially when that complex was built, she was not a fan of it, but in a way it did grow on her. And she told the New York Times in 2008, she said, these complexes, once they're built, they take on a life of their own, and so there is, because of the accumulated decades and the experiences that people began to have at Lincoln Center, it took on a new kind of, I guess, patina of appropriateness, if you want. But she did say, interestingly, when the Juilliard building was built, she said, it's a good building. You can't fail all the time. So even when she was decrying Lincoln Center, just for the exact reasons that you mentioned, she would, if she saw good design, she would say so.
Okay. Do you know what she thought of the World Trade Center?
Yes. She called it the daintiest big building in the world.
It's great. What about the Guggenheim?
What about the Guggenheim? So the Guggenheim opened in 1959, and so she was writing architectural criticism at that time, but she wouldn't have been a daily critic. So I'm not sure about her writing on the Guggenheim. I'm sure she did, though. I think the issue with Ada Louise Huxtable, and these questions are wonderful, but the issue here is that this is a woman who was at the vanguard of architectural criticism in the United States for half a century, which means that she wrote on any number of buildings and did so with eloquence, but it is genuinely impossible to touch on all of them.
Mm-hmm.
In this lecture, or really at any time, because she was so prolific, and also because her influence was so profound. And so all of these questions are wonderful, and she did indeed have opinions on any number of buildings. It's just, if they were not included in this lecture, it's not for lack of meaningful discourse on her part, it's just a lack of time, because it's, her archive is so rich, and the the way that she interacted with the city was, so infinite.
So one more question about building thoughts, but a more general one. We heard you speak about her thoughts on like the super talls and what effect that might have, and we know the effect that they are having. Did she get a chance to really examine the sliver buildings?
That's such an interesting question. So she died in 2012, and she was at that time when her contract for the Wall Street Journal, between 1997, when she started writing for the Journal, and 2013, she died in January of 2013. So during that time, her contract was for 6 pieces a year. So she was writing really every 2 months for the Journal. And so she would only weigh in on very meaty and specific things, which is why her testimony around the New York Public Library or around Hudson Yards was so meaningful, because she was writing so sparingly at that time, in a way that she wasn't doing at the times when she was writing every day, for example, and so I don't know necessarily that during that time in those 6 pieces a year, if she did or didn't take on the sliver buildings, but that's just my own lack of knowledge. It doesn't mean she didn't.
Mm-hmm. Another one kind of in the same vein of discussing large centers, what you thought about Rockefeller Center and comparative with Hudson Yards.
Sure. So she loved Rockefeller Center because it was so beautifully planned into the city, and was, while a private space, also a civic space, and built that way necessarily by Raymond Hood. And it was an interesting contrast that she drew, which was to say, here was the bottom line and the issue of wealth and of power and of money, but not at the expense of architecture and design. She said that so often the city and city planners and elected officials, mayoral candidates, so on and so forth, did not think in terms of design and would not spend their money in that way. But the Rockefellers, because this was a privately financed situation, the Rockefellers not only engaged the most lauded architect of the time, who was Raymond Hood, but also allowed him to work within sort of his own sense of what was good and right, and then championed that, and then paid for that, and so on and so forth. And so again, when she talks about something like Penn Station, and she says a city gets what it wants and is ultimately willing to pay for and deserves, in that case, the Rockefellers were willing to pay for extraordinary design and to allow for that to flourish. It wasn't like they were going to say, oh no, you have to do this, you have to do that. They let Raymond Hood create something of real value for the city, because it was within his artistic purview to do that, and they paid for that and they supported that. And so that was really the point that she was making, was, okay, when we have this tension in New York, as we always do, of money and profitability and art, where does the money go and what does the money support? And in this case, in something like Rockefeller Center, it supported something that was deeply meaningful for the city of New York, that became a public space, even though it was a private space, and therefore was extraordinarily good design.
Great, thank you. Okay, as it is now 7:12, I think we are going to end it there. Thank you, everyone, for all of your questions. Thank you, everyone, for joining. This was great. I learned a lot. I hope everyone else did too. I'll pass it over to Ariel.
Yes, thank you again. Thank you, Lucy, so much. That was so marvelous. And to everyone for your active participation. We're so grateful to have you all here. Thank you for all of your work that you are all doing towards preservation and making our city all of the things that we love. Have a great evening. Keep an eye out for our follow-up email. We just have a quick survey, and I'll include a bunch of the links from tonight's talk. So thank you. Thank you again so much, Lucy.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure. I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Yeah, you too. Have a good night, everyone.
Okay, everyone.